The road to Dudley Town was little more than a cracked ribbon of asphalt, swallowed by dense forests that seemed to lean in closer the further the team drove. The GPS was dead an hour ago, leaving the team to rely on old maps and vague directions from the locals. Marcus Ward, the team leader, gripped the steering wheel tighter as they passed a faded sign. Welcome to Dudley Town, though welcome seemed a cruel joke. Beside him, Riley adjusted her gear, glancing at the dense fog rolling in. "I don't like this place already," she muttered, her breath visible in the cold air. The rest of the team was silent, their usual banter replaced by a heavy tension. They were seasoned investigators. Each one had faced things that defied logic, but this place, it felt different. As they reached the town, it became clear why. The once thriving area was now a ghost town, its buildings decaying, windows shattered, and streets deserted. But it wasn't just abandonment that made it unsettling. It felt alive, like the air itself was watching them. They parked near the town center, where a crumbling church loomed like a sentinel over the hollow streets. The government had sent them after reports of bizarre deaths. Locals found mutilated beyond recognition. Officially, it was a wild animal attack. Unofficially, whispers of dark entities, demonic rituals, and cursed souls brought the team here. Marcus ordered them to set up base, distributing the ghost hunting equipment they had used countless times before. EMF detectors, thermal cameras, EVP recorders. But as they did, a piercing silence settled over the town. No birds, no insects. Not even the wind stirred. "Too quiet," Riley muttered, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Spread out," Marcus commanded. "Stay close. We don't want to." Before he could finish, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, coming from the woods on the outskirts of town. Without hesitation, they grabbed their gear and rushed towards the sound. They found nothing, no body, no sign of a struggle. Just silence, oppressive and thick. Then one of their team members, Jake, froze, his flashlight illuminating something grotesque. A twisted, unnatural shape hunched over in the trees. A crawler. Its eyes glowed faintly as it turned toward them, its mouth stretching wide in a grotesque grin. "Run!" Marcus shouted, pulling his sidearm. The creature moved, faster than anything human, crawling on all fours like some demonic spider. The team scattered, shots ringing out as they fled back toward the town. But when they regrouped at the church, Jake was missing. "No!" Riley whispered, her face pale as they stared into the dark woods. The crawler had taken him, and they had no idea where, or if he was even still alive. The fog grew thicker, creeping closer to the town like some living thing. And as night fully settled in, the realization hit them: they were not alone. The hunt had begun. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Marcus called the team together. The fog was thick now, swirling like smoke, making every step feel like it could be their last. The dread that settled over Dudley Town had grown, an oppressive weight that made the air taste metallic. "We're splitting into two teams," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We need to find Jake." Riley, still shaken from the encounter with the crawler, shot him a look. "You really think he's still alive?" Marcus didn't answer, but his silence said everything. If Jake was still out there, he wouldn't last long. Not in this place. Riley nodded and fell into formation with Marcus, while the rest of the team, Chris and Sarah, headed towards the woods where Jake had disappeared. As they trudged through the thick underbrush, Riley's EMF detector began to flicker, spikes of energy lighting up the screen. "Something's out there," she whispered, scanning the area. Suddenly, a rustling sound. Quick, frantic, just ahead. The team froze, flashlights darting toward the noise. Then came a low growl, a guttural, almost human sound. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its skin pale and stretched over bones too thin to be human. A skinwalker. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes locked onto them with a sickening intelligence. "Don't move," Marcus ordered, his hand hovering over his weapon. But it was too late. The creature let out a screech that echoed through the trees, its form shifting grotesquely as it charged. Marcus fired, the bullets doing little to slow it down. Riley swung her camera around, capturing the creature's movements, hoping to document whatever the hell this thing was. But the skinwalker moved too fast, weaving between the trees. It lunged, claws outstretched, aiming for her. "Down!" Marcus tackled Riley to the ground just as the skinwalker flew overhead, crashing into the underbrush behind them. In the confusion, they scrambled to their feet and ran, the sound of snapping branches and growls echoing behind them. They broke through the tree-line into a clearing, hearts pounding, but they weren't safe. From the corner of her eye, Riley saw something worse, a shadow man. It hovered at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible but oozing malice. It didn't need to move. Just its presence sent icy fear crawling down their spines. Back to the church now, Marcus yelled. They ran, the creatures on their heels, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they raced for safety. But as they neared the town, something became terrifyingly clear. Jake wasn't the only one missing. The church was their sanctuary, but not for long. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, echoing in the hollowed-out space. But even inside, it didn't feel safe. The air inside was cold, almost suffocating, as if the church itself was dead, abandoned by God, just like the rest of Dudley Town. Riley's hands trembled as she secured the windows, peering out through the cracks in the boards. The fog clung to the streets outside like a second skin, thick and unnatural. There was no movement, no sign of Jake, but the feeling of being watched was constant. That thing, it's not going to stop, Chris said, his voice a low whisper. His face was pale, eyes wide as he stared at the floor. Whatever it is, skinwalkers, crawlers. They're not going to stop until we're dead. Marcus ignored him, pacing near the altar. He was thinking, calculating, trying to figure out their next move. We need to find out what happened to Jake. He's not the only one who disappeared. This town's been swallowing people for decades. Right, because that makes me feel better, Riley muttered, her fingers tightening around her EMF detector, which hadn't stopped flickering since they returned. A low groan creaked through the church's walls, followed by a faint whisper that seemed to echo from the shadows. Riley's heart raced. Did you hear that? Chris nodded, backing toward the center of the room. It's coming from the basement. No, Marcus growled, his eyes dark. No one goes down there. But it was too late. The door to the basement swung open with a slow creak, revealing a set of old wooden stairs descending into the darkness below. The smell that wafted up was thick, damp, rotten, like something had been festering there for years. Without thinking, Riley moved toward the stairs, drawn by something she couldn't explain. "Riley, stop!" Marcus shouted, but his words felt distant. She stepped onto the first stair, and suddenly, the temperature dropped further. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the floor beneath her creaked ominously. Then a sound, a soft voice just below her, whispering her name. "Riley!" She froze, her blood turning to ice. It was Jake's voice. "Jake? Is that you?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, only more whispers, growing louder, twisting her name into something sinister. The EMF meter in her hand spiked violently, and before she could react, something grabbed her ankle from the darkness below. She screamed, yanking her leg back, but the grip was iron-tight, pulling her down. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing her arm just as she was dragged halfway down the stairs. The force pulling her was inhuman, relentless, and for a second, she saw it, a shadowy figure lurking in the basement, with Jake's face twisted into something grotesque. With a final tug, Marcus pulled her free, slamming the basement door shut. But as they caught their breath, they realized they were not alone in the church anymore. Night fell fast, wrapping Dudley Town in a suffocating blanket of blackness. Inside the church, they set up their gear, the room filled with the soft hum of machines and the glowing light of their equipment. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the silence was too loud, like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something. Marcus adjusted the thermal camera, eyes scanning the feed. Anything. Riley shook her head. "No, but we should move soon. I can feel them out there." Her voice trembled, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to suppress. Suddenly, Chris's walkie-talkie crackled to life, static breaking the silence. A voice, barely audible, came through the speakers. "Help, help us." The team exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't Jake's voice, but someone else. A rescue team had been dispatched earlier in the day, but they hadn't heard a word from them since. "Rescue team, come in," Marcus spoke into the walkie-talkie, his voice tight. "Where are you?" More static. Then the voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "They're everywhere. Oh God, they're everywhere." Suddenly, a loud bang rattled the windows, followed by a sharp scraping noise along the walls outside. It was as if something was dragging its claws across the building, circling them. Riley's heart raced as she rushed to check the windows. The fog outside had thickened, but through the haze she could see movement, figures crawling along the ground, their bodies distorted, broken. "Crawlers," she whispered, stepping back from the window. "They're here." The creatures were grotesque, their bodies long and misshapen, skin stretched tight over their bones. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, scuttling on all fours like insects. The way they skittered across the ground was enough to make Riley's stomach turn. "They're surrounding us," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, the front door rattled, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Then the scraping grew louder, more frantic. The crawlers were attacking, and there was no way out. "We need to hold them off," Marcus shouted, grabbing a flare gun from his pack. He fired through one of the broken windows, the flare lighting up the night and revealing the nightmare outside. Dozens of crawlers swarmed the church, their eyes glowing red in the light, their mouths wide with jagged, crooked teeth. Riley grabbed the EMP blaster, praying it would do something, anything. She fired, the pulse radiating out into the night, and for a moment the creatures hesitated. But it didn't last long. They kept coming, scratching and clawing at the doors, breaking through the barricades with relentless fury. "We're not going to make it," Chris whispered, backing into the corner. "They're going to kill us all." The scraping at the door turned into pounding, and then the door gave way. The church door gave way with a deafening crash, splintering under the weight of the crawlers. The creatures poured in like a flood, their twisted skeletal bodies moving with a disturbing, insect-like precision. Riley's breath hitched as she fired the EMP blaster again, sending out a pulse of energy that slowed them, but only for a moment. "Fall back," Marcus shouted, grabbing Riley and pulling her toward the back of the church. Chris was already retreating, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he fumbled with the door that led to the bell tower. The crawlers surged forward, their eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. They moved too fast, too violently, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Marcus fired another flare, but it barely slowed them. Their jagged teeth gnashed together, the sound a sickening chorus of death. "Up the stairs, now!" Marcus yelled as the creatures closed in. They bolted up the narrow spiral staircase, the wood creaking under their weight. Behind them, the crawlers' claws scratched the floor, tearing into the wood as they ascended. Riley's heart pounded in her chest, her hands slick with sweat as she clung to the railing. They reached the bell tower, the air colder here, as if the very presence of death had seeped into the stone walls. Chris slammed the door shut behind them, throwing his weight against it as the creatures pounded against it, their screeches filling the air. "That won't hold for long," Marcus muttered, looking around for something, anything, that could buy them more time. Then the whispering began, soft, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus, dozens of voices, overlapping, blending together into a twisted melody of terror. Riley pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but the voices seemed to sink into her mind, pulling at her thoughts. "Do you hear that?" Chris whispered, his face pale. "It's them," Marcus said, his voice low. "The people who disappeared, the souls trapped in Dudley Town. They're trying to warn us." But the voices weren't just warning them, they were calling them, beckoning them toward something. Riley stumbled back as the bell tower itself seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ancient iron bell above them swaying as if moved by unseen hands. "Make it stop," Riley cried, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. They whispered her name, their cold breath on her neck, their words twisting in her mind. She could feel them, pressing in on her, suffocating her. Suddenly, the door to the bell tower exploded inward, and the crawlers surged through. Riley screamed, and Marcus fired one last flare, the light blinding them all. But in the light, for just a second, Riley saw something else. a shadow figure tall and menacing, standing in the corner of the room, watching them. Then everything went dark. Riley's eyes snapped open to pitch-black darkness. Her head throbbed, and for a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it hit her, the church, the bell tower, the crawlers. Panic set in as she struggled to sit up, her hands trembling. She could hear the others groaning, still coming to. "Marcus? Chris?" she whispered into the dark, her voice shaky. "Here." Marcus's voice came from nearby. "Barely." Riley fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers clumsy from fear. When the light flicked on, it illuminated the small space of the bell tower. The room was empty, no crawlers, no shadow man. Just the three of them, disoriented and alive for now. "What happened?" Chris asked, his voice tight with panic. "I don't know. One minute we were fighting them off, the next, they were gone," Marcus said, shaking his head. "But I saw something before the flare hit. Something worse. Worse than the crawlers?" Riley's heart skipped a beat. "Yeah," Marcus said grimly. "A demon." The word hung in the air, making the already suffocating space feel tighter. Riley's breath hitched. She knew this was more than just ghosts or creatures. They were dealing with something ancient, something evil. Suddenly, the bell above them began to swing again, this time more violently. The noise was deafening, each clang reverberating through the stone walls, shaking the floor beneath their feet. Dust and debris rained down on them. "We need to get out of here," Riley shouted, bolting for the stairs. They ran down the spiral staircase, the bells clanging growing louder behind them, as if it were chasing them. When they reached the bottom, they burst through the door and out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But as they staggered outside, they realized they weren't safe. The town had changed. Thick fog now blanketed the entire area, but through the haze they could see them, figures shadowy and barely visible, walking aimlessly through the streets. They weren't human. Their movements were too unnatural, their shapes distorted. "They're everywhere," Chris muttered, taking a step back. Riley's heart raced as she spotted something far worse. In the distance, at the edge of the fog, stood a towering figure, its eyes burning bright red, its body cloaked in darkness. It was watching them. "The demon," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. The figure raised its hand, and suddenly, the ground beneath them shook violently. Cracks splintered across the street, and from those cracks crawled the creatures, more of them than before. Crawlers, skinwalkers, and shadow men, all converging on them at once. The demon had unleashed them all. "Run!" Marcus screamed, and they took off, sprinting toward the only building they could see through the fog. But as they ran, the whispers came again, louder now, filling their heads with the voices of the damned. The demon was in control now, and it wasn't letting them go without a fight. The fog clung to the ground like a suffocating shroud, swirling in hypnotic patterns as the rescue team's trucks pulled into the outskirts of Dudley Town. The flashing red and blue lights did nothing to pierce the thick haze. The radios crackled with static, cutting in and out, garbled voices pleading for backup. Inside the church, Marcus, Riley, and Chris watched from a broken window, their faces pale, streaked with grime and fear. "They're sending another team," Riley whispered, her voice laced with a thin thread of hope. "They'll get us out of here." But Marcus wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed as he watched the figures step out of the rescue vehicles. They moved slowly, cautiously. Too cautiously. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "They're not safe." The rescue team, dressed in tactical gear, moved toward the church, their flashlights cutting through the fog like beams into an abyss. But as they approached, the air grew colder, unnaturally cold. Ice crystals formed on the truck's windows, and the radios went silent. "Do you see that?" Chris pointed to the far side of the street, where a figure stood just beyond the reach of the headlights. A shadow man. The rescue team didn't seem to notice. They moved closer to the church, unaware of the danger lurking in the fog. Marcus grabbed his radio, his voice hoarse. "Turn back! Get out of there!" But no response came. One by one, the rescue team members froze in place, their flashlights flickering, as if the darkness itself was devouring them. Riley's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in horror. One of the rescue workers stepped forward, his flashlight dropping from his hand as he vanished into thin air. No escrim, no stragel, just gone. What the hell? Chris whispered, stepping back from the window. What just happened? Another figure disappeared, swallowed by the mist, followed by another. It was as if the town itself had come alive, claiming them one by one. In the distance, the Shadow Man's figure grew clearer, its dark form shifting unnaturally. "They're being taken," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "We need to get out before we're next." But just as they turned to leave, a violent gust of wind howled through the broken church, slamming the door shut with a bone-rattling thud. The windows trembled, and the voices came again, louder this time. Screams, whispers, cries for help. The souls of Dudley Town were awake, and they were hungry. Suddenly, the floor beneath them quaked, cracking open. From the shadows, crawlers emerged, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Marcus fired his blaster, but there were too many. The creatures surged forward, hissing and gnashing their teeth. The rescue teams were gone, vanished into the ether. And now it was their turn. The church trembled, every crack and splinter in its walls vibrating with the pulse of something ancient, something hungry. Outside, the fog seemed to close in tighter, suffocating them, as if the town itself was a living entity, trying to devour everything within its borders. The demon was drawing them in. Marcus reloaded his blaster, his hands shaking. "We make for the trucks. Now, it's the only chance we have." "But the crawlers," Riley started, her words cut off by the sound of shattering glass as one of the creatures crashed through the window, its long claws digging into the wooden floor. "They're everywhere," Chris yelled, grabbing an EMP blaster from his bag. He fired wildly at the creatures swarming the church, but for every crawler that fell, 2 more took its place. The stench of death filled the air, choking them. Marcus motioned to the back exit. "Go. I'll cover you." Riley and Chris didn't hesitate. They bolted toward the door, ducking as another crawler lunged at them from the shadows. The creature's claws scraped across the stone walls, sending a shower of debris in their path. Behind them, Marcus fired a shot, the pulse of energy lighting up the room in a burst of eerie blue light. But then, just as they reached the door, it slammed shut on its own. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the air, sending chills down Riley's spine. She spun around, her heart dropping. At the far end of the church, standing amid the chaos, was the demon. Its eyes burned with a malevolent fire, its presence sucking the air out of the room. "Welcome to the end," it growled, its voice reverberating through the church like thunder. Riley's knees buckled under the weight of the demon's gaze. It was too powerful, too ancient. There was no escape. "We're trapped," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus gritted his teeth. "Not yet. We take out the altar. That's where it's drawing its power." The demon's laughter grew louder as the ground beneath their feet began to split, revealing the altar below, dark, twisted, and pulsating with an evil energy. The shadows grew longer, and the crawlers hissed, circling them like vultures. "We need to get to that altar," Marcus shouted, "or we're all dead." Chris fired his last round of flares, sending a temporary burst of light through the church, enough to disorient the creatures. "Go now!" They sprinted toward the altar, dodging the crawler's claws and the demon's fiery gaze. The walls of the church groaned, on the verge of collapse, as the malevolent presence tore at its foundations. But just as they reached the altar, the demon stepped forward, raising its clawed hand. The air shimmered, and Marcus felt his body freeze, his mind gripped by a force stronger than fear itself. The demon's voice filled his head, a cacophony of voices, screaming, begging for release. "Your souls are mine." The atmosphere inside the church became suffocating, the very walls pulsing with malevolent energy. Marcus, Riley, and Chris stood before the altar, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and blood. The demon's laughter echoed, a low rumble that sent chills through their bones. "We need to destroy it now," Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of wails that filled the air. But as they prepared to make their move, Riley suddenly stumbled backward, her hand clutching her chest. Her eyes widened, confusion and pain flickering across her face. I don't understand," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. What's happening to me? The demon's laughter grew louder. Its burning gaze fell upon Riley, the truth unspoken but palpable. You, it hissed, are one of us. Marcus's eyes shot to Riley, disbelief and confusion flooding his mind. What the hell is he talking about? Riley's face twisted in terror, her hands trembling as the truth began to unravel. No, this can't be. I'm not part of this. The demon stepped closer, its clawed fingers stretching toward her. Oh, but you are, it crooned, a malicious smile twisting its face. Your blood, your family, they started this ritual. You're the key, the final piece. No, she screamed, backing away. But the darkness was already coiling around her like a serpent. Marcus grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she jerked away, her skin burning hot to the touch. You knew, Chris muttered, eyes wide. You've been part of this all along. Riley shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. But her body betrayed her. The shadows reached out, curling around her, pulling her closer to the altar. Chris raised his blaster, pointing it at Riley, his face pale with fear and rage. We can't trust her. She's part of this. Chris, don't. Marcus shouted, but the tension between them was palpable. Before they could react, the demon's power surged, and Riley's body was lifted off the ground, her screams blending with the cries of the souls trapped in Dudley Town. She writhed in agony, suspended in the air, as the ritual reached its peak. You must finish the ritual, the demon said, its voice resonating in the very marrow of their bones. Only then can you free her or destroy her. The choice hung heavy in the air. Destroy the altar and risk losing Riley, or complete the ritual and unleash something far worse. Marcus! Riley's voice broke through the chaos, pleading, desperate. You have to stop it. You have to kill me. Please, before it's too late. But Marcus couldn't move. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the decision crushed him. The room darkened as the demon's power swirled around Riley, her body convulsing in midair as the ritual neared its completion. The altar pulsated with a sickening red glow, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to reach out like hungry fingers. We don't have time, Chris yelled, his eyes wild with panic as he fired at the crawlers emerging from the cracks in the floor. They were closing in fast, their hissing and screeching growing louder, more relentless. Marcus's grip tightened on his blaster, his mind racing. The decision felt impossible. Save Riley or destroy the demon and risk losing her forever. Sweat dripped down his brow as the demon's laughter echoed in his ears, taunting him. Choose, human, the demon hissed, its eyes burning with sadistic glee. Your friend's soul or your world. Chris made the first move. Screw this, he snarled, raising his blaster toward Riley. We have to end this. No. Marcus lunged at him, knocking the weapon from his hands. The two crashed to the floor, fists flying as the tension between them exploded into violence. Around them, the church shook, the very foundation cracking under the weight of the demon's power. As the two fought, the Shadow Man appeared again, its form flickering in and out of reality, growing more solid with each passing second. The walls moaned, bending inward as if the entire building was being swallowed into another dimension. We have to destroy the altar, Marcus screamed over the chaos, shoving Chris off him and staggering to his feet. He turned to Riley, who hung limply in the air, her eyes rolling back into her head. Chris, bloodied and furious, spat on the ground. There's no saving her, Marcus. She's gone. But Marcus refused to believe it. He aimed his blaster at the demonic altar, the power surging within him. We end this now. With a deafening roar, the demon lunged forward, its claws outstretched. But just as it reached them, Marcus fired. The blaster hit the altar dead center, a flash of blinding light exploding from the impact. The altar cracked, splintering into pieces as the demon howled in fury. The ground beneath them trembled violently, the air thick with screams as the spirits of Dudley Town were released, spiraling upward in a chaotic storm of shadows and light. The crawlers screeched and scattered, vanishing into the void as the power of the demon weakened. Riley dropped to the floor motionless, her body pale and cold. Marcus rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest as he knelt beside her. "Riley," he whispered, shaking her gently, "please wake up." For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the aftermath. But then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We did it. The demon was gone. The curse was broken." But as Marcus helped her to her feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered, watching, waiting for its next chance to rise.